Very good to see you all this morning, and I understand you may be delaying your break to hear from me, so I'm really sorry. I hope you're prepared to put up with it. I don't know whether any of you have been to the Outer Hebrides and to Barra in particular. Any hands up for anyone who's been to Barra? Yes, my goodness. Well, I was there yesterday morning. And it's a hell of a culture shock arriving in central Birmingham after being in the Outer Hebrides yesterday morning. But it's very good to be here. And I'd also like to, in particular, thank CPI and the Restraint Reduction Network for doing this, because it's something that's very dear to my heart. And I find it immensely encouraging that there's this whole group of people in this room discussing such an important issue. This has been quite a journey for me. I was Minister of State in the Department of Health, responsible for mental health and learning disability from September 2012 through to the general election last year, when you may have noticed the Liberal Democrats were almost annihilated entirely. I am one of the very few survivors, for better or worse. But it was after less than a year in that job that I was suddenly confronted by Mind, the campaign organisation Mind, producing a Freedom of Information Act survey. And I was asked by the BBC to be interviewed to respond to the issues that were raised in that survey. And it was the first time, to be honest, that I'd really reflected on the issue of restraint. And it was the first time that it had ever really been brought to my attention as minister. But what I saw from the results of that survey, I found personally really disturbing, really shocking. And it forced me to feel that we had to do something to respond. What the survey showed was, first of all, very heavy use of face-down restraint across the country. Also massive variation with very little to indicate any justification for that variation of practice around the country. Just to give you two examples, Surrey and the Borders had declared, and this is important because it may in part be just a difference in the recording of what happens in an organisation. They had declared 38 incidents of restraint in the previous year. Tees and Wear Valleys had declared 3,000. And the staff survey, which had been undertaken by Mind and published at the same time, showed that 22% of staff who'd been surveyed had had no proper training in this vital issue, and 42% of those surveyed accepted that they had witnessed or been involved in the use of restraint in inappropriate circumstances. Now, we just have to remember as we discuss this that this is the use of force, often by the state or agents of the state, against highly vulnerable individuals. And so it's an issue which we have to take with the utmost seriousness. And I was really interested in listening to Sam's reflections from her particular perspective. And it made me feel highly uneasy about the state of things and determined to act. But there were three other things around that same time that caused me equal concern. First of all, I became aware of the death of Olaseni Lewis, a student, a graduate in London. I don't think he'd had any mental health issues prior to a voluntary admission back in September 2010. He was a 23-year-old, an IT graduate from Kingston University. On the day of admission, he was restrained on 3 occasions before his collapse. The final restraint was by police who'd come into the health unit where he was being cared for, in inverted commas, and he died later that day. And I became aware of it because the Member of Parliament for his parents contributed to a debate in Parliament, and I was responding as the Minister. And this was a Labour MP, and I was so horrified by what I heard that I offered in response to meet with his parents to discuss their concerns. And at that stage, the police complaints, the IPCC had rejected the investigation. It was subsequently reopened, but his parents were left in a state of total distress at what had happened. And just think about this, the inquest, this was a death in September 2010. The inquest is due to take place on the 7th of January next year. Just imagine what that family is going through. I found the meeting with his parents an extraordinarily traumatic and in many ways profound experience, but it made me driven to try to do something from my position to address these issues. The second thing that happened to me was I was asked to speak at a conference for black mental health, actually in Wolverhampton, not too far away from here. And it was the most challenging experience I'd had as a minister. There was a room full of people who were distressed and angry at the experiences of so many loved ones at the hands of the mental health system in this country. There was a sense of discrimination that loved ones, black people, had suffered disproportionate experiences of restraint and sectioning and so on. And I met on that occasion the sister of one man who had lost his life. And I came away from that session feeling, again, deeply disturbed by what I'd heard. And then the final event that happened that shocked me was I'd invited into the department as we set about how we would respond to the Mind survey, a group of people, practitioners, academics, but also people who'd experienced the use of restraint. And listening to the people who had experienced restraint, for me, was in a sense the real moment when I realised what this actually meant to people, particularly people who had at an earlier stage in their lives suffered some form of abuse. And it just made me realise that there was a moral imperative, really, on all of us to find ways of reducing this practice as much as we could, avoiding its use wherever it was possible to do so. Now, I concede readily that I am a layperson. I have no experience of looking after deeply troubled individuals who have suffered all sorts of distress in their lives and who may be very difficult to manage. And so I was aware also that there was an enormous risk that people would just accuse me of stupid idealism, of being impractical, of making, of imposing restrictions on the system that were completely unreasonable given the cohort of people that we were dealing with. So I wanted to turn to what I would call progressive practitioners, people who actually knew what it was like on the front line, doing the work, and what was possible to achieve. And in that regard, one of the individuals that stood out for me was Tim Kendall, who is now the National Clinical Director. And I remember seeing him on television when the first report of the Mind survey was published. And he had talked about how in the unit in Sheffield, they had decided to eradicate the use of face-down restraint and had set about a means to achieve that objective, as well as significantly reducing the other forms of restraint. I talked also to Joe Rafferty, the chief executive of Merseycare, where they had introduced something they call No Force First. I visited them there. I witnessed the inpatient ward where they had trialled it to start with. I saw a cellist from the Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra playing to a group of men. It was the most bizarre experience, but they were all enthralled by her playing. And I heard from Joe Rafferty about how staff initially had been very anxious about the implications of No Force First, that they felt that they would be at risk themselves, but that after a year of implementation, they had seen sickness absence from staff radically reduce. Staff was safer as a result of the changes that they had made. And they had created a therapeutic environment where it was much better for people to go about the process of recovery. And I also looked across the Atlantic to what was going on in America. And I always think of America as having the very best and the very worst of healthcare. It's a system that is completely dysfunctional in so many ways, with so many people denied basic entitlement to care, something that's being partly addressed by President Obama. But along with all those horrors in America, there is examples of great practice. And Professor Kevin Huxhorn, who I immediately assumed with a name like Kevin was a man, but it is in fact a woman, has developed the 6 core strategies. And the approach that has been applied using these strategies in many institutions has radically changed the experience of many people in that country. And I was inspired by what I heard. I've then talked to Joy Duxbury. Where is Joy? Joy! Hello. I talked to her by phone to start with, and then we met up in Birmingham just a few weeks ago, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I saw people doing amazing work, leading the way, finding a different approach, and having an impact. In the Northwest, Joy and the program that she has instituted there has seen a significant reduction in the use of restraint in the units where it has been applied. And I find that immensely inspiring. Well, what did I do as Minister? Well, we went about the process of commissioning new guidance. We used someone from the Royal College of Nursing to do the work for us. I was insistent that we must be quite radical in what we proposed, but within the bounds of what, as I call them, progressive practitioners argued was appropriate and achievable. So we argued within the guidance that we should end the use of face-down restraint and that we should set about strategies that seek to avoid the use of restraint wherever possible and overall achieve a significant reduction in the use of restraint. We called it positive and safe. We had a £1.2 million staff training budget, and this is the way it was described. The aim is to provide a framework with which adult health and care services can develop a culture where restrictive interventions are only ever used as a last resort and only then for the shortest possible time. It identifies key actions that will better meet people's needs and enhance their quality of life, reducing the need for restrictive interventions. It also sets out a mechanism to ensure accountability for making these improvements, including effective governance, transparency, and monitoring. Very much reflecting, actually, the 6 core strategies from Professor Kevin Huxhorn in the United States. Well, so what has happened since then, since they were published back in 2013? Well, quite depressingly, we undertook a repeat of the Mind survey a couple of months ago. comprehensively across the country. And what we found was that in 2013-14, there was a total of 57,183 restraints across the country. By 15-16, it had gone up to 66,681, a 17% increase in a 3-year period. Now, I absolutely recognise that this may in part be due to better recording of what happens in institutions, but it certainly does not mark a significant reduction, which is what we were after. And again, massive variation. 8,000 in Northumberland, Tyne and Wear, 75 in Devon. Hardly credible, those differences, I would suggest. And we also, of course, have to take into account differences in size, differences in the mix of patients that various institutions are working with. But in Coventry and Warwick, for example, the use of restraint has almost halved from 4,500 to 2,400 in a 2-year period. Face-down restraint has gone down marginally from 12,800 to 12,300 over the 3-year period. Injuries to staff and to patients on the increase, according to what has been recorded. Last year, 1,548 injuries to patients and 2,789 injuries to staff. Now, it seems to me, therefore, that the imperative for change is as strong as ever. So let me just make some concluding remarks. First of all, I ask myself the question, why is it that restraint has gone up according to the data recorded? Well, it seems to me that part of the reason is likely to be the fact that so many inpatient settings are under, in my view, impossible strain, often with occupancy rates around the 100% mark, suffering staff shortages, often having to rely on agency staff. This is not the sort of circumstance in which you can achieve great things for patients and critically keep staff safe. But I think also there are grounds for hope. There are some organisations now setting about a programme of dramatically changing how they operate. And I give them enormous credit for challenging the established culture and for trying to do things differently. And here, this group of people gathering together, I find immensely hopeful. So what do we need to do? Well, first, relieve the pressure on inpatient wards. Now, in part, that has to be about funding. And there is a shortfall of funding of mental health in this country. It's a historic situation, but there is not yet anything like equality between mental health and physical health. And we all have to campaign for that basic principle that everyone who needs health care from our NHS should have the same right to good quality treatment as anyone else. And that does not yet exist in this country. And in my view, it's shameful and has to change. Secondly, we have to shift resources from what I would call containment to prevention, to early intervention. In Sheffield, led by Tim Kendall, they've managed to repatriate people from out-of-area placements at enormous cost to the local health economy. They've reduced at the same time the number of beds that they've got, which are very expensive. They've shortened the length of stay, and they've reinvested the savings from doing those things in much better community support, much better crisis support to prevent the deterioration from happening in the first place. That seems to me to be the approach that we should be following in this country. In Devon, an inspiring psychiatrist has led an approach with people with personality disorder who had been in out-of-area placements, now supported within the community. And in the period of 5 years that they've been running this programme, there hasn't been a single loss of life from a very, very challenging group of people, now leading much better lives than they'd experienced previously. Secondly, there has to be a renewed commitment nationally from this government and from NHS England to the absolute central importance of this issue, to not allow it to slip down the priority order, to make sure that it is front and foremost in people's minds. There is a moral case for this as well as a therapeutic case. Third, training is essential. There is no accreditation of training in this country across the board, and there needs to be, in my view. Absolutely, I support CPL on that completely. Fourth, we can't afford not to do this. Merseycare make the case that by applying their no force first approach, they will actually end up saving substantial sums of money. If they radically reduce sickness absence, then they have much lower use of agency staff, and the whole dynamic changes. They use the resources much more effectively. And fifth and finally, we just all need, in our own ways, in our own circumstances, to do what we can to make the difference. And at the moment I am chairing a commission on mental health in the West Midlands. And I wanted to challenge the system in the West Midlands to regard this as of central importance. So I linked up with Joy Duxbury. We had a meeting last month, bringing together key leaders across the West Midlands, medical directors, chief executives of mental health trusts. And we have agreed with Joy Duxbury to pursue an application to the NIHR, the National Institute for Health Research, for a significant grant in order to implement a programme across the Northwest, where Joy has already worked, and the West Midlands, so that we build the evidence of what is possible in this country, and we do everything we can to make the lives of very vulnerable people much better. Thank you very much indeed.